So hello viewers, today we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Martin Owens, whose recent collaborative paper in CPoIB has been turning heads.
I'm very well, Han. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this excellent idea. My name is Dr. Martin Owens. I'm a senior lecturer in international business at Sheffield Hallam University, based in the United Kingdom. I have a PhD from the University of Ulster, and my research specialises in understanding how political violence intersects with international firms and their activities. I think undoubtedly the IB terrorism literature significantly influenced me to research in the area of political violence and terrorism. I think those papers in those conceptual papers in the early post 9/11 space by scholars like Michael Sankota, Gabriel Sader, Gary Knight, and others were very, very influential and very important to the literature. And they did a fantastic job in establishing the foundations of IB terrorism research. However, I always thought from day one, personally thought from day one, that literature was slightly too focused on high impact, non-state transnational type terrorism. And that's only one type of terrorism that's sort of causing problems for companies in international markets. And furthermore, and related to what I've just said, I wasn't convinced of this terrorism argument, which seemed to be a central dimension in the justification of why terrorism mattered for IB. There are many issues with that terrorism argument I'm not go into, but I think one major consequence of that terrorism argument is that it presented domestic terrorism as very traditional domestic terrorism as not that significant. On the basis of very little evidence. So I was very keen to make a redress on this and to understand how domestic terrorism impacts companies in foreign markets. Domestic terrorism obviously shares some commonalities with transnational terrorism, but it is qualitatively different, and it is the most common form of terrorism in the world today. So hence the paper. The paper is about understanding how domestic terrorism impacted companies in foreign markets. The other thing, I'd probably be remiss of me not to say this, but I think the other, in terms of experience, the other factor would be the fact that I'm from Northern Ireland, and as you know, Northern Ireland's endured several serious decades of political violence. So that background has given me, I think, an enormous insight into the gravity and nuances of political violence and how it can impact commercial activity and society in general. I think it's very clear to me that political violence operates, in many different ways beyond the direct violence that we commonly associate it with, like shooting and murder. So, for example, political violence does operate through discourse and language and labeling. And I was keen in the paper to show how discourse influences the perception of the terrorism threat, and also how it generates psychological and emotional costs for managers in foreign markets. It was a very challenging process indeed within the review process, very much so. There was a lot of issues that the reviewers raised. I think one issue was that one reviewer wasn't convinced that the contribution was significant enough. I wasn't convinced that the paper was strongly connected enough to IB. So we had to work very hard on addressing those concerns. Another reviewer initially thought that we were a bit disrespectful to existing IB terrorism research, and so we had to sort of dial down the critical tone in the writing. In terms of findings, and that's a kind test question. I think undoubtedly the most significant finding of the paper is this relationship between state terrorism and multinationals. I think up to this point, we've been socialized into associating terrorism with non-state actors, and they are undoubtedly prolific actors of terrorism. But the reality is that the state is the biggest actor of terrorism in the world. And a lot of that terrorism has been driven by economic agendas, including FDI. So in the paper, we've tried to initially show how M&Es are complicit with state terrorism through intentional and unintentional ways. Firstly, I think the research adds to this very broader, welcoming conversation in IB that's currently taking place in terms of how IB relates to grand themes or grand social issues such as refugee crisis, the environment, poverty, and so forth. I, along with scholars in international relations and political science, would argue that state terrorism is an antecedent in a cause of those big issues. I mean, if you go into literature and read work around like David Maher and Richard Jackson and in IR research, they have talked about how state terrorism is a major cause of human insecurity and human rights violations in the world today. So it is significant. Related to that, my research in general, I think, adds to a critical conversation within IB that's largely been expressed in this journal. And rather than just focus on how multinationals and IB work around political violence, I have sought to understand how IB and multinationals are contributing and causing political violence and capitalizing on political violence. Now, that hasn't gone entirely unnoticed. People like scholars like Jennifer Otzel and Christine Witte, they have argued that this point, but I think more could be done in not showing how multinationals are exploiting political instability and political violence and how that elicits different forms of violence on stakeholders. I'm also keen to go in sort of deconstruct this term violence and understand how violence works in different ways. The other interesting stream of research that's happening at the moment is this by HRM scholars who are looking at how managers are working in very politically hostile, dangerous environments. And I think our research provides some insights into the implications of using host country managers in politically violent markets. And I think HRM scholars could build on that. Yeah. Yeah, I think the first thing to do is I think based on my experience, is take your time in developing the paper. Don't be in a rush, make sure that you develop a very strong theoretical framework and build up a set of strong contributions because it will save you time and indeed pain in the review process. I think what you could do towards that aim is to actually show your work to maybe to a colleague or two outside of the research team. This is something I don't do enough, but it's something I would encourage you to do because it's always useful to get another opinion in terms of just to see if the work is ready for submission. The other thing I would say, a piece of advice is probably related to what I've just said is make sure that the research is contributing to IB. I think we are inspired by other academic disciplines, and that's a good thing. But make sure that you're confident that the research is contributing to IB because this is an IB journal at the end of the day, and reviewers will expect that there's a strong contribution to existing IB knowledge. If it contributes to another academic field, then you should take advantage of that. Just obvious is just make a very compelling argument for the paper in the introduction. Make sure your paper sets out a very strong case for the paper. Make sure that you clearly show that the paper is adding or contributing to existing knowledge in your respective literature stream.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin, for sharing with us today.
Thank you very much. Nice to talk to you.